Good evening. This is Officer Kent LeBlanc, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit with you guys about medical technology in the Civil War. Um, to put it bluntly, medical technology during the Civil War sucked. It was awful. Most of the time, if you were injured, unless you were extraordinarily lucky, it was a death sentence, right? There was not much healing that went on in the hospitals. One sort of quote, something that I read, I think describes it very well. The Civil War was a modern war accompanied by medieval technology in terms of medicine. Right? All the things we sort of take for granted about medicine. For example, it's probably a good idea to wash tools before you use them. That disease is typically caused by microorganisms rather than bad smells or bad fumes. All of that did not even compute for people in the Civil War. Medicine was incredibly primitive. As I mentioned previously, if you were going to a field hospital, odds are you weren't going to survive. And part of something that really exacerbated how awful the medicine was, the camps themselves, where soldiers stayed, were very unhygienic. Again, they didn't have any knowledge of microorganisms, what actually causes illness. I can't even imagine being at a Civil War era camp, and just the sights and smells and all that kind of stuff. Because at this period of time, we hadn't quite made that connection between sort of personal hygiene and illness. I mean, I think sort of flashing forward a little bit, I always remember reading this in my blue book whenever I was at basic, right? The Army is, at least in theory, very good nowadays about saying how important it is to keep wounds clean, how important it is whenever you're out in the field to find some safe way of disposing of your waste rather than just having within your camp, right, and letting all sorts of nasty infections, nasty diseases spreading through. And sort of to make this even worse, during the almost at the Middle Ages, well, it was basically the Middle Ages, right, with the technology they had, there were no antibiotics, right? Penicillin wouldn't be invented really until about penicillin wouldn't have been discovered until about the 20th century. So not only did we have sort of unsanitized tools and all sorts of little microorganisms creeping about, we had no antibiotics to take care of them whenever, say, an arm started to get gangrene, right? Unless wounds were incredibly minor and able to be cleaned up, really the only effective method of healing soldiers during the Civil War was through amputations, right? If you were lucky, your bullet wound would just be sort of at the end of your arm or something like that, or on your ankle or something. If you were unlucky, it wasn't uncommon to lose entire arms, entire legs, rather than just a hand or something similar. So, obviously, since the medical equipment wasn't sanitized, the leading cause of death were infections. If you can think, the surgeon, I use that term lightly, would just chop off a soldier's leg, right? And then without even running water over the bone saw that he just used and brutalized someone with, I can just imagine him tossing whatever the leg is into a wheelbarrow somewhere and going on to the next soldier with the exact same equipment. And that isn't a very pleasant sight. It's not a very pleasant thing to think of. Luckily, during this time, I sort of looking on the bright side here. Anesthetics had been invented by this time. The most commonly used one was chloroform. And of course, good old alcohol. I mean, if you give someone enough whiskey, right, I guess they'll be out of it enough to where it'll make the surgical process go by a little bit more smoothly. But chloroform was often used. And about midway through the Civil War, there was actually an innovation in getting chloroform in the way of an inhaler rather than just a handkerchief, where you would lose the majority of the chloroform, which by all accounts wasn't exactly cheap. You would put it into an inhaler, and it'd be a much more efficient way of anesthetizing soldiers. So, and I have a poster that has a couple of medical tools that whenever I sort of get on site, I'll be able to explain sort of in detail what some of these tools did. But the most common injury was bullet wounds, right? Whether cannon or rifle fire, small arms fire. So, and to their credit, the surgeons within the Civil War understood just how little they could do for their soldiers. So I have a pretty extensive quote from a surgeon sort of explaining the crap that the surgeons had to go through. So here's what he has to say. It's unnecessary to do more than make an allusion to the difficulties which surrounded this department at the engagement at Gettysburg. The inadequate amount of transportation, the impossibility of having that allowed brought to the front, the cutting off of our communication with Baltimore, the uncertainty even as late as the morning of July 1st as to a battle taking place at all, and if it did, at what point it would occur, the total inadequacy of the railroad to Gettysburg to meet the demands made upon it after the battle was over, the excessive rains which fell at that time, all conspired to render the management of the department one of exceeding difficulty. And yet abundance of medical supplies were on hand at all times. Rations were provided, shelter obtained, and as soon as the wagons were allowed to come to the front, although not as abundant as necessary on account of the reduced transportation. Of course, what he's referring to there, wagons were allowed to come to the front, what we now call ambulances, right? That was really, at least sort of stateside, an innovation of the Civil War. So it wasn't all doom and gloom, even though they were a pretty inefficient way, judging by this quote, to sort of transport injured soldiers. Okay? And the medical officers did their best with what they had. And that's sort of like the main point this medical officer is trying to make here, right? Medical officers' attendants, ambulances, and wagons left when the Army started for Maryland, and the wounded were well taken care of, relatively speaking, I suppose, and especially so when we consider the circumstances in which the battle was fought and the length and severity of the engagement. The conduct of the medical officers was admirable. Their labors not only began with the beginning of the battle, but lasted long after the battle had ended. When other officers had time to rest, they were busily at work, and not merely at work, but working earnestly and devotedly. So this is especially true for us soldiers at the 129th RTI because of our, I'm going to get my MOSs mixed up here, our 68 whiskeys. Yes, 68 whiskeys. They're sort of a continuation of the surgical corps that really sort of started to take formation during the Civil War. So with all this in mind, I just have one or maybe two discussion questions I sort of want to share with you guys. So here we go. How has medical field care advanced since Gettysburg? Did the unfathomable amount of casualties at Gettysburg have an impact on the development of medical technology? Right? Because keep in mind, I believe Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the war. I can't even imagine the amount of soldiers who were injured with sort of subpar primitive medical care. But sort of looking back, I think we might be able to see some similarities to tactical combat casualty care, which we covered last weekend, and the Civil War methods of surgery. The differences are going to be pretty easy to come across, but what are some of the similarities that we have with these Civil War surgeons, these Civil War medical officers?